The morning of the dedication ceremony, nobody gave the old man a second glance. He arrived alone, the way he always did everything. No fanfare, no one holding the door, no one saving him a seat. He wore the same olive canvas jacket he'd had for 30 years, the collar frayed at one corner, the left pocket stitched back on with thread that didn't quite match. His boots were clean but old, the kind of boots that had walked through things no one at this ceremony could imagine. He found his spot near the back of the crowd, behind the families in their pressed black clothes and the officers in their full dress uniforms, and he stood there with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes moving slowly across the names on the wall. Nobody looked at him twice. Why would they? He looked like someone's grandfather who had wandered in from the parking lot. A little too thin, a little too quiet, the kind of man who exists at the edges of events, present but invisible, noticed only when he's in the way. A woman in a dark blazer glanced at him once, the way you glance at someone who might be lost, and then her attention moved on to the podium where the general was adjusting the microphone. His name was Elias Boone. He was 73 years old, and not one person at the Fort Bragg Military Working Dog Memorial dedication knew who he was standing in front of them. That was exactly the way he preferred it. The ceremony had been 3 years in the making. The memorial itself, black granite, 12 feet high, engraved with 847 names, honored the military working dogs that had served in every American conflict from Korea to the present day. The dedication had drawn senators, a 4-star general, the Secretary of the Army, 2 former presidents via video message, and roughly 400 people who crowded the plaza under a November sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. The 8K9 teams present were the centerpiece of the ceremony. 8 handlers, 8 dogs, 7 Belgian Malinois, and 1 German Shepherd, all of them active duty, all of them decorated, standing at the front of the crowd in 2 neat rows, while their handlers held their leads with the quiet confidence of people who had complete trust in their partners. These were not pets. These were athletes and soldiers and partners. They had been trained from puppyhood for single-minded purpose, conditioned through thousands of hours to ignore distraction, to hold position, to respond to one handler and one handler only. In a crowd of 400 strangers, they would stand like statues if their handlers asked them to. That was the expectation. That was not what happened. The general had been speaking for about 12 minutes when it started. The German Shepherd, a 7-year-old male named Ranger, decorated twice for explosives detection in Afghanistan, turned his head, just slightly, the way a dog turns its head when it hears something no human can hear. His handler, a staff sergeant named Ellison, didn't notice immediately. She was watching the podium. Then Ranger stood up. He'd been in a downstay, a command he had held for 2 hours during a training exercise the previous week, without so much as shifting his weight. But he stood up now, and his nose went to the air, and his tail, a tail that was trained to remain neutral in professional settings, began to move. Ellison looked down. She gave a quiet hand signal. Down. Ranger didn't sit back down. He took 1 step forward, then another. Ranger. Her voice was low, controlled, trained to stay calm. Ranger, heel. The dog stopped for a moment, turned and looked at her, and then, as if he had made a decision, as if he had weighed something in whatever way dogs weigh things, he turned back and pulled forward, and the lead went taut in Ellison's hand. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be replayed in phone videos for months. Every single one of the other 7 dogs stood up, not in sequence, not one at a time. Together, as if a signal had passed through them that no human could detect. 7 Belgian Malinois and 1 German Shepherd, all of them abandoning their trained positions at the exact same moment, all of them orienting in the same direction, leads going tight in 8 different hands. 8 handlers suddenly gripping hard and exchanging stunned glances with each other over the tops of their dogs' heads. The general stopped speaking. The crowd turned, and all 8 dogs were pulling toward the back, toward the thin man in the olive canvas jacket who stood with his hands still folded in front of him, and his eyes wide and bright, and for the first time, all morning, something moving across his face that hadn't been there before. It was Colonel, retired, Darren Fitch, who reached him first, not because he was trying to intercept anything, but because he happened to be standing nearby, And because when 8 military working dogs start moving through a crowd of 400 people, you move. "Sir," Fitch said, stepping toward the old man, do you need to step back from? Let them come." The old man's voice was quiet, not frail, not uncertain, just quiet. The way still water is quiet. "Let them come. Sir, these animals are, I know what they are." He looked at Fitch then, and something in that look made the colonel stop talking. "I know exactly what they are." The first dog to reach him was Ranger. He pressed his whole face into the man's hands. This dog who was trained to assess every stranger as a potential threat. This dog who had gone through a selection process that washed out 80% of candidates. This dog who had never once broken a command in 4 years of active duty. He pressed his face into those weathered hands and made a sound that everyone nearby would later struggle to describe. Not a whine, not a bark. Something lower, something that seemed to come from a different part of the animal entirely. The others arrived within seconds. The old man didn't step back. He lowered himself slowly, his knees clearly complaining about it. And he knelt on the grass and he let them come. All 8 of them circling him, pressing against him, some of them licking his hands. One of them, a young Malinois named Kilo, with 17 confirmed fines in Syria, who simply sat beside him and leaned all of his weight against the old man's shoulder and stayed there. Ilsen stood with the slack lead in her hand and stared. "Who is this man?" someone near her said. She didn't have an answer. His file, if you could find it, would tell you only the broad strokes. Elias Boone. Born 1951, rural Kentucky. Enlisted 1969. Vietnam. 2 tours, then a gap, a long gap, the kind that doesn't show up in public records. The kind that appears in certain files as a series of redactions and code designations that don't correspond to any unit that officially exists. What the file doesn't tell you is that between 1974 and 1991, Boone was part of a classified program whose name has never been declassified and whose existence was acknowledged only in a single footnote in a 2004 Senate Intelligence Committee report that most people never read. The program trained military working dogs for operations that didn't happen in countries that weren't visited, for objectives that were never written down. Boone wasn't a trainer in the conventional sense. He was something rarer, a man who seemed to understand dogs the way a musician understands an instrument, not through mechanics, but through some quality of attention that couldn't be taught in a manual. He spent 17 years in that program. He trained over 200 dogs. He developed a handling methodology that was eventually folded into the standard K9 training doctrine used by every branch of the military without his name attached to it. When the program ended in 1991, Boone went home to Kentucky, bought 40 acres outside a town called Harlan, grew corn and kept to himself and never told a single person in that town what he had done or who he had been. He had driven 6 hours to Fort Bragg that morning, because he'd seen the announcement for the memorial dedication in a veteran's newsletter he'd been receiving for 20 years without ever attending an event. He'd read the list of names on the wall, dogs, not humans, because that's what this memorial honored, and he'd recognized 3 of them. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He hadn't called ahead. He'd parked his truck at the edge of the lot and walked in and found a spot at the back where he wouldn't be in anyone's way. That was all he'd intended to do. It was a young Army captain named Whitfield who figured it out, standing 20 feet away with his phone still recording, running the name through a database on a hunch that turned into something else entirely the moment the results came back. He walked over to where a brigadier general named Okafor was standing with his arms crossed, watching the scene with the expression of a man trying to decide how to feel about something unprecedented. "Sir." Whitfield held out his phone. Okafor looked at the screen, read, looked up, looked back at the old man on the ground with 8 dogs around him. "Read again." "Is this current?" Okafor said. "Cross-referenced with 3 sources, sir." "And the methodology reference?" "The one in the tology reference. The one in the 2019 MWD training revision. It cites the original program documentation." "He wrote it." Okafor was quiet for a long moment. The old man was talking softly to the dogs. No one close enough to hear what he was saying. His hands were moving slowly across their heads and shoulders, the way you touch something you recognize. "He trained their bloodlines. Whitfield said quietly. Ranger's grandsire, Kilo's great-grandsire. 3 of the others, the lineage goes directly back to dogs he worked with in the program. Okafor said nothing. They didn't learn to recognize him, Whitfield continued. They recognized something in him. Something from generations back. The general looked at the old man for a long time. Who knows he's here? Okafor said finally. Nobody, sir. He drove himself. Came alone. He's not registered anywhere. Okafor uncrossed his arms, straightened his jacket, and then Brigadier General Thomas Okafor, who had commanded troops in 3 wars and received the Distinguished Service Medal twice, walked toward the back of the crowd with the kind of deliberate pace that clears a path without asking for one. The crowd parted without being told to. That's the thing nobody talks about afterward. How the 400 people around the plaza simply moved aside, not because anyone asked them to, but because something was happening that everyone felt required a certain amount of space. Okafor stopped 2 feet from the old man and stood there. Boone looked up from the ground, one hand still resting on Ranger's head. Mr. Boone, Okafor said. Something passed across the old man's face. Not surprise, more like resignation. The look of a man who had lived a long time behind a particular door and recognized the sound of someone finally finding the right key. General, Boone said, I need to ask you something. Ask. Why didn't you tell anyone you were coming? Boone was quiet for a moment. One of the Malinora shifted against his knee, and he steadied it with his hand before he spoke. This isn't my day, he said. It's theirs. He glanced toward the wall. The names. 847 of them. I just wanted to see it. 3 of those names on that wall? I know, Boone said. Rex, Sergeant, and a dog we called Compass, though they didn't put his operational name. His registered name was different. He said the registered name softly, and Okafor's aide, standing nearby with a clipboard, wrote it down without being asked. You trained them. I worked with them. There's a difference. Okafor crouched down, not something a brigadier general does often, but he crouched down until he was at the same level as the old man and the dogs. He looked at Boone for a moment before he spoke. You wrote the methodology, Okafor said. Half of what these handlers know. The bonding protocols, the stress inoculation training, the multi-handler transition system, it comes from your work. Boone shook his head slightly. It comes from the dogs. I just paid attention. You're being modest. I'm being accurate. He scratched behind Ranger's ear and the dog's eyes went half closed. Dogs don't respond to techniques. They respond to presence. Someone figured that out before me. I just wrote it down. Okafor sat with that for a moment. The crowd around them had gone completely quiet. 400 people standing still in the November cold, nobody checking their phone, nobody whispering to their neighbor. There are people here who would like to thank you, Okafor said, formally, if you're willing. I don't need thanking. That may be. But they need to say it. What happened over the next hour was not part of the program. The general who had been at the podium, a 3-star named Brennan who ran MWD operations for the entire army, came and shook Boone's hand and held it for a long moment and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the handshake didn't already cover. 2 of the handlers cried, not the young ones, who were still trying to process what had happened with their dogs. The older ones, a master sergeant named Fontenot, who had been handling dogs for 18 years, and a warrant officer named Isley, who had buried 2 partners in the last decade. They both knew the weight of what this man had given them without knowing his name, and when they finally knew his name, something in that weight shifted. Ellison, Ranger's handler, sat beside Boone on the grass for 20 minutes while Ranger lay across both their laps and everyone else kept a respectful distance. He's never done that, she said. He smells what I'm carrying, Boone said. Which is what? He thought about it. 30 years of dogs, he said finally. It's in my hands, in my clothes. It doesn't wash out. Ellison looked at Ranger, who had not moved and showed no signs of moving. He found my husband, she said quietly. 3 years ago, before we were married, Ranger found him under 60 feet of rubble in a building collapse in Mosul. Worked for 11 hours without stopping. Boone looked at the dog. "I know," he said. "I read the citation." She turned to look at him. "I read all the citations," he said. "Every year. All the dogs. I follow what they do." He paused. "It's the only way I know how to still be part of it." His name wasn't added to the program that day. There was no speech. He didn't go to the podium. What there was, a folded flag, produced quietly by an aide and presented to him by Okafor without ceremony, and a handwritten note from the Secretary of the Army that had been drafted in the 2 hours since Whitfield ran that database search, written on official stationery, and sealed and placed into Boone's jacket pocket by a man who seemed to understand that anything more public than that would be wrong. There was also this. When the ceremony resumed and the 8K9 teams returned to their positions, every single one of the dogs looked back once before they sat down. Not at their handlers. At the old man. He had found a seat by then. Someone had brought him a chair, though he'd tried to wave it off. And he was sitting near the wall, with his jacket still on, and his hands folded in his lap, looking at the names carved into the granite. Rex, Sergeant, and the one they'd called Compass. Registered name different. A dog who had saved 11 lives in a single operation in 1983 and whose story had never been told outside of a classified document that still hadn't been declassified and probably never would be. Boone had been there for that, had been there for all of it, had stood where no one would ever be able to say he stood, done things that would never appear in any history, and come home and grown corn and kept 60 years of silence about all of it. He sat there in his frayed jacket and his old boots, and he looked at those names, and something moved across his face that wasn't sadness exactly, and wasn't pride exactly, but was something that exists in the space between those two things, where only people who have carried a certain kind of weight for a very long time tend to live. Nobody in the crowd around him knew his name yet. Word was spreading, but it was spreading slowly, the way true things tend to spread, not in a rush, but in quiet conversations, person to person, each person pausing a little before they passed it on. The man who trained their bloodlines, the man who wrote the doctrine, the man who drove 6 hours alone and stood at the back so he wouldn't be in anyone's way. He left before the reception. Of course he did. He found Okafor near the parking lot and shook his hand and thanked him for the ceremony, as if Boone were the guest and Okafor the host. As if the whole remarkable thing that had happened that morning were simply a pleasant afternoon he was grateful to have attended. "You don't have to leave," Okafor said. "I've got a long drive. We have accommodations. The Army would be honored to." "I've got a dog at home," Boone said. "Old female. She doesn't like to be left overnight." Okafor almost smiled. "What's her name?" "Compass," Boone said. He let that sit there for a moment. "Her grandmother was the one on the wall," he said. "I brought her home when I retired. The line didn't end. I just took it with me." He looked back at the memorial one more time. The black granite caught the gray November light and held it. That's what you do with good things. You don't let them end. You carry them. He turned and walked to his truck, an old Ford, the kind with the paint fading at the edges, parked by itself at the far end of the lot. And he got in, and he drove away before anyone thought to get his number. Before the journalists who had heard something was happening could get close enough to ask a question, before the ceremony photographer could frame the shot, the parking lot filled the space where he'd been standing. The granite wall caught the light, and somewhere on the drive back to Harlan, on a 2-lane road through the Kentucky foothills, an old man drove with the window down despite the cold, and in the cab of the truck beside him, an old female dog with gray around her muzzle lifted her nose to the moving air and then settled her head back down on his knee. He drove. The road curved through the hills. He had done what he came to do.